Much, Leanne, and just getting back to that conversation, and thank you so much if you've been with us, Advocate Vusi Pikoli and Eusebius McKaiser, and just taking a look and dissecting, our responsibilities, the legalities and the ethics around public servants, especially in the wake of what is currently playing out with the PPE scandal and this money set aside meant to help South Africans against this pandemic that has so devastated the world and our economy, not even to go there, and yet people still saw their way clear to actually steal from the poor in a manner that some would try to justify. But we are discussing the matter of ethics, and that's in the spotlight for us this morning. So, Eusebius McKaiser, if I can just come back to you. We spoke now about the legalities around what public servants should be considering, what does govern them, but why are ethical standards so important, and why are they perhaps even more important than legal standards?
Sakina, firstly, thank you for having this conversation and continuing it after 8 o'clock. It is a really complicated conversation, and I was trying to cram a lot of concepts before 8, and so thanks for staying with the topic dynamically for a couple more minutes. I agree with Advocate Vusi Pikoli that, in a sense, we shouldn't make simple things complicated. If some things are criminal, then there should be criminal sanction for non-compliance. But I do think over the long term, and it's not a but, it's an and to his comment, if we want to increase the likelihood of compliance with ethical codes, we need to explain to people what the internal logic is for the high standards that we demand of them. And the reason why ethical standards are particularly demanding is that they answer to non-legal questions, such as the following questions. What kind of society do I want to live in? What kind of person should I try and be when I open up my eyes in the morning? And what does it mean to be a moral person in the world where I've got social relations and I want those relations to be of a certain moral quality? Those are the kinds of questions that we study as philosophy students when we specialize in ethics, as I did as a postgraduate student in moral philosophy. And those are the kinds of questions that you grapple with when you pick the men and women that you want to put in the state. Now, I think the mistake that major political parties around the world face, if they don't pay enough attention to those selection criteria when they decide who should be a DG, who should be a minister, who should be a high-ranking official within the top 6 within the NEC. They don't ask those questions. And if you have a shortage of ethically skilled men and women in your society, for whatever sociological reason, then the whole point of setting up a political school, as the ANC promised it to do. You'll remember when you and I were at Mangaung, the next 10 years were meant to be the decade of the cadre. That opportunity was lost to then set up a school, and you can't set up a school that's headed by someone that was in prison. Set up a school that takes seriously the kinds of tools that we can get from philosophers, from ethicists, and use those tools to inculcate in the men and women that are part of your political party the tendency to behave ethically. So the standard is extremely high because the question to which ethics answers is a very different question to the question to which criminal law.
All right, Eusebius seems to have frozen there, but if I can just come to Advocate Pikoli, Advocate, just following on, the points that have already been made, and we look at things like weak institutions and, of course, weak governance as one of the fundamental causes of corruption. So can we honestly look into governance issues honestly as a nation and overcome the problems that we currently have? Do you believe that we, as the system is right now, with the systemic corruption that we are facing as a country, can we self-correct at this point?
Well, Sakina, thank you. Can I just take you back to our Constitution, Section 195, that talks to promoting and maintaining, professional high ethics within the public service. That should be our starting point. And it's a pity that I've got to take you back to 1996. I know it's 2020 now. But some of the things that we did in 1996 always have a way of coming back to us. Because in 1996, Cabinet adopted the National Crime Prevention Strategy, which for the first time came up with a comprehensive strategy to fight crime in South Africa. And one of the points there was more the question of crime prevention, without necessarily saying that we should stop committing crime and wait for such a time that, we have prevented crime. The essence of that was on public education. So there are no shortcuts when we want to cultivate a culture of doing the right thing, a culture of obeying the law, especially when, we have accepted the rule of law as one of our principles as a constitutional democracy. Now, what we need to do, it's not that complicated. If we've got a law that is not capable of being enforced, then what's the point of having that law? And we've got various law enforcement that have got a specific task of dealing, with those who break the law. For me, it's not such a complicated issue. Of course, these law enforcement agencies must work together. But if we were to be specific and talk about corruption, the problem we have is that we don't have a single dedicated anti-corruption agency in the country. We've got all these various institutions, the SIU, we have the Hawks, we have the Investigating Directorate in the NPA, you have the Financial Intelligence Center. They are lying all over. There's not a single command. Therefore, even if they are to come together and collaborate, they come together as equals, because there's no one who's calling for a single, line of command, line of march. So what we need to do is to have that single entity that is independent, that should be insulated from any political interference, so that it's able to do its work without fear, favor, or prejudice, that it is highly resourced, and that there's security of tenure. So we need to have such, an entity, a single entity that has got as its sole mandate to fight corruption.
So that scenario that you paint there for us, Advocate Pikoli, is that by design or is it by default?
Well, the reality and the history tells us that since the demise of the Scorpions, the country lacked that dedicated unit that is independent. I think perhaps as a country we need to have this conversation, and then also just go back to the Glenister judgments, for instance, when the Scorpions were disbanded and then you had the Hawks coming up. That the court there, addressed the question of having an independent corruption-busting agency, where there's also security of tenure, where the executive will not be able to interfere or obstruct the work of such a single entity. So the principle that was followed by the DSO, the Troika principle, which was basically talking about prosecution-led and intelligence-driven investigations. It meant that all these elements were housed under one roof with one commander. It made it much easier to deal with complicated corruption matters. Of course, corruption is not a simple crime. You do need to have the necessary skills, and this brings in the question of continuous training of all those who are involved in the fight against corruption. You need to have your forensic auditors, your analysts, your cyber crime specialists, your investigators, commercial crime investigators and prosecutors under one roof. That's the only proven way, that can deal with issues of corruption.
And perhaps in wrapping this up, Eusebius McKaiser, as Advocate Pikoli speaks there about corruption and taking your earlier point about ethics as being embedded in our social relations, as ordinary South Africans, what can we do? What do we need to do to make sure that this democracy actually works for us?
That's a very important question, Sakina. We are often told, I don't like this slogan, but I think it's unfair on us that we get the government that we deserve because we pick them. When we pick men and women, I don't think we give them license to be corrupt. So I don't like that particular slogan. But what we can do is to use our power maximally. And we've got democratic powers with which to make sure that while we are dealing with a criminal justice system, a criminal justice value chain that has been hollowed out as a result of state capture, that we use civil society muscle to make sure that there are consequences for those who are corrupt and who steal from you and I. And that kind of consequence management on our part can come in many forms. It means that we can disincentivize political parties by not voting for them. It also means that we can speak up and blow the whistle when we see wrongdoing happen. And it also means that you and I as civil society need to strategically cooperate, and despite all differences ideologically and politically as citizens, to recognize that sometimes we need to cooperate as citizens despite our differences for the sake of our common good. And very often you found that the scoundrels get away with looting because you and I are too busy being divisive and talking about our differences rather than actually single-mindedly focusing on demanding that those who are in the state, regardless of which political parties they come from, do better than they have done thus far.
Well, gentlemen, we can, of course, go on forever and a day, but we have to leave it there for today. But thank you so much for engaging us and giving your time. Former NPA head advocate Vusi Pikoli and media personality commentator Eusebius McKaiser talking to us about the legalities and the ethics around public servants doing state with the business and, of course, our responsibility as citizens in this democracy. Right, let's take a quick break.